Okay. I want to express our deep thanks to the Heritage Council for organizing our visit, which has been really interesting from the beginning to the end, and of course ICOMOS Ireland as well. For the Heritage Council, it was really our pleasure. When I first spoke to Colm in Paris at the ICOMOS General Assembly, the idea of really doing something that meshed with the work of the Heritage Council was really important and appealing. And what I want to do, well, you know, I should say, Gustavo had first said that Connor had stolen his thunder. And I can say now that we're probably experiencing a real thunderstorm here, because some of the real points that Gustavo brought up about the difficulty of dealing with the new heritage landscape are very sensitive, and they're not resolved, and they're deeply changing. There are many dimensions, many values that we wanted to talk about. So basically, I want in the next few minutes speak to you as friends and colleagues and people deeply interested in heritage to try to think together about how. We've mentioned some very deep questions. There are many paradoxes, tensions, conflicts in the field of heritage today. And so I'd like to make this presentation in a way of really getting down to the work, to rolling up our sleeves and seeing how those ideals that are emerging so forcefully can really be brought to fruition, to really become powerful new paradigms and ways of working in heritage. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk about a few of the changes that we've all experienced in heritage, some of the questions that we need to resolve, and some answers that some people around the world have come up with. So let me start first with the changes, because in many ways, all that was once so solid has really vanished into thin air. As it says, heritage is not what it used to be. When many of us who are now getting older grew up, there were rarely few questions about authenticity, about what should be a heritage site. In fact, as Gustavo mentioned, in the history of heritage, which began the history of official heritage, because that, after all, is the framework that we're dealing with, it's very much tied to the emergence of the modern nation and the taking of what were private buildings and monuments and so forth and making them part of a national narrative. And those national narratives had certain steps along the way, and each monument was sort of a hieroglyphic symbol of one stage of the story. The stories usually began in the mists of prehistory and ended almost inevitably with the present government. And today, we see that more and more people are offering their own endings to that narrative. Here's a picture from just a few weeks ago in Greece, where the ideal that is the icon that, as Gustavo said, began the whole heritage story, has been given a different ending by public reaction. So this sort of indicates that we are in a stage now, partially the information age, partially the idea of declining authorities of one kind or another, that people feel free and intelligent enough to respond to the icons. So in the means of communication that we're talking about, that Deidre mentioned, that our committee is so involved with, we're shifting a little bit from communications theory to the public sphere. That is, that years and years ago, the idea of the excellence of public interpretation was how effectively the message got through, the facts got through. Today, it's really something quite different, as we'll see. Now, in our world of weekends and trips, the past has become a theme park in many instances. That under economic pressure, under developmental pressure, the idea of the past as a tourist destination has also changed how the story is told. Sometimes the stage machinery and even that embodied narrative from the car park, through the ticket booth, through the interpretive trail, out to the gift shop and the cafeteria, has become a more powerful narrative than anything about the history itself. Now, that of course, is something that everyone deals with in the planning and financing of major heritage sites. And we'll talk in a few minutes about how communities are involved with that. Last is no less important, that the past is a capital for political legitimacy, particularly among regional groups, minority groups, trade groups, and so forth. Here's a picture in the United States of a Native American group that has had real, Native American groups in general have had real power in changing some of the laws, and for better or for worse, groups all over the world see the possession or repatriation of heritage artifacts as a kind of exercise of political power. Just as the early nation states created their citizens by teaching them a narrative, other groups are now claiming we have other narratives and so forth. Now, those are some of the questions. We'll continue with that, but we have real problems on how to actually effect this link with community. And these are unanswered questions. First, and most of all, I want to stress the long debates that we had in our committee and we had in the shaping of the charter between two terms that are often used as synonyms, often used interchangeably, but really do underline a problem we have in conceptualizing this communication, that is presentation and interpretation. Presentation generally refers to the presenting by an informed or expert source of the content of a heritage site to the public. Interpretation, however, is a little bit more open-ended. And you see in these two pictures, on the one hand, it seems on the left, the old idea of presentation. But that is interpretation too, because we have redefined interpretation, not merely as experts redefining or understanding what the significance or outstanding universal value or local value of the sites are, but an activity that is shared by visitors and experts alike. Because even in the picture from the 1950s of these two very well-behaved school children looking at a presentation, they're trying to interpret really what that means. And likewise, in a modern reenactment at Waterloo in Belgium, you have a weekend visitor thinking about the demonstration that he is seeing. Maybe he's wondering why this person chooses to dress up in a Napoleonic outfit on the weekends, or if his explanation is correct. And we would argue that shared act of interpretation is the central process. That's what we've got to cultivate. It's not a question of more effectively communicating some value that we have chosen as experts, but it is to exercise the long, unexercised memory and reflective muscles of the public memory. For too long, we have taught our school children to listen carefully and to learn the facts. The next question really is, what is the object of communicating whatever we communicate? And I think that, as Gustavo said, from the example of the Borough Charter and our own interpretation and presentation charter, I think that the emphasis on creating memory communities has overshadowed the goal of communicating historical facts. Historical facts always come from a certain perception of narrative, and more, the activities that are done in the public are meant to shape people's relationship with the past, not merely their knowledge of facts and figures about it. And finally, a real question that faces us, because we use this word community again and again and again. And there's this sort of romantic sloganeering about community, because as Gustavo said, there are many different kinds of communities, and it's difficult in one locality to really understand. You can splinter them down to even individuals or family groups, and not only that, there are paradoxes in the position that we are putting communities in. Are they at their heart participants, or are they observers of their own heritage? And this is a series of really difficult paradoxes, not only between who is the audience and who is the teller of the tale, but boundaries between public and private, between official and remembered, between living and preserved. These are all the conflicting issues that we need to engage with more deeply, and we will get on to a few suggestions of how that can be done. But I think overshadowing everything is the new imperative. And that has many causes. It has causes in the general economic situation. It has causes in the withdrawal of public institutions from support of culture. It has a lot to do with a market economy. And here too, we're often dealing with slogans. What does sustainable development mean? It seems to be sort of an oxymoron. Something is either sustainable or it's development. Development deals obviously with change. And I think that I would title also, an alternative title for this next slide is be very careful of what you wish for. Because in many cases, those who win the contest or the challenge for economic development often pay in a profound transformation of their community. When the community becomes a destination for tourists, whether it is on a everyday basis or a yearly festival, there are many unseen, unaccounted costs that go into the calculation of is that economically successful. Often, the local authority, and that means the taxpayers in the locality, are taking off expenses from the bottom line in terms of just sanitation, in terms of traffic and infrastructure and so forth. Because at the same time that we are making these tourist destinations, the heritage is discovering a whole range of new things that are not monumental, that deal with those aspects of intangibility that Gustavo mentioned. And Gustavo, who is very modest about his founding a metaphor and an expression, vessels of value, really has captured what heritage has become. We were always very concerned with the material fabric of monuments and so forth. But if we consider them to be vessels of value, then our job as heritage conservators, interpreters, managers, and so forth becomes a very different one. Our responsibility is to really keep those vessels in good working order and allow people, communities, to change what they see in those vessels. And here you just see very, very traditional conservation and a very perishable piece of folk art, both being equally vessels of very different values. Because the truth is, heritage is as much about the future as it is about the past. And we have to understand that there is no essentialism. We're not involved in cultural taxidermy of stuffing some essentialized frozen past. Whether we look at the urban landscape of Dublin or any city, any village, we see that it is this progressive mixture of individual creative, not so creative expressions that really is, in fact, the flow of culture itself. So it's little wonder that the time had come for ICOMOS as an international body to really attend to this problem of interpretation and presentation. Before the encouragement of Gustavo, when he was a vice president, I would say about in the first decade of this century, in 2003 or so, the situation in ICOMOS was that all the scientific committees, all the experts, believed that they could take care of the interpretation and presentation themselves. It was really more or less a matter of taking the academic opinion and putting it into simple sentences or something like that, adding a few pictures as well. There was this idea of the seamlessness and single value of the expert opinion. But as these questions and these changes really began to sink in on all the levels, we realized that there were some principles that we have to attend to in terms of interpretation. And what resulted, anyone who's interested can, of course, look on the ICOMOS website and find more detail, but just the basic principles of this charter do not deal with any specific content. We're not talking about what people should say about a site, but they are principles of public engagement that you can understand. They range from the physical access or the intellectual access to as many different sources of information as possible. Context and setting, authenticity is a tough problem these days, since there are many different criteria for authenticity. But certainly sustainability. The fact is that I have seen too many examples of ambitious local communities, with the help of national agencies, believe that their heritage site will be the next Pisa or Venice, and they're sorely disappointed when the huge amount of investment that they put in relative to their own earning power or tax basis doesn't really pay off. Finally, inclusiveness in research and education and training. These are all can be seen as just very, very basic guides for how people have got to take the interpretive task seriously. And I just wanted to conclude by offering a few practical frameworks that we have found very important, because there are two real problems that have to be attended to when people talk about the engagement of community. One is conflict. Heritage, by its nature, is a drawing of the boundaries between us, that's heritage, and then outside the boundaries of heritage is them. Now, those them could be a really mortal enemy, or just outsiders who aren't as connected to the heritage. And that is a problem, especially when one is encouraging the visiting of visitors from outside. What is the attitude that must be taken? The second one, and this I think that everyone has mentioned, everyone involved in heritage knows today, and that is the lack of capacity. Even if we were to go back to that once upon time heritage, where the national criteria of significance and the listed buildings were all that there was, we simply don't have enough funds to even deal with heritage on its old, strictly physical conservation way. So those problems of conflict and capacity. Gustavo stressed capacity building, and I'm saying that even our overall capacity is limited. So let me just show a few examples. Now they're all going to look the same. The next few slides are all people sitting around a table, but they're from very, very different parts of the world with very different problems. This first table that I'm going to show you comes from Ronse in Belgium, where the small town, which was very much in the shadow of the great tourist attractions of Bruges and Ghent and so forth. Also a mill town in which the mills are all closed now. Also on the language boundary between the French-speaking and the Flemish-speaking parts of Belgium, and also the site of tremendous Muslim North African immigration. Had really nothing left to sell but its soul and wanted to come up with the development of a tourist attraction there. So they basically were looking for some sort of spectacular multimedia virtual reality presentation of their 14th century cathedral in Ronse, which was at one time a pilgrimage site. But when cooler heads prevailed, they realized that the expenditure in one site, and this is again a problem that we'll conclude with World Heritage, it shouldn't be all spent on that. And basically, I was working with the Anami Center in Belgium at that time, and we urged the people of Ronse, under the new criteria of what is important, to look at their whole, well, you can call it an ecosphere, from recipes to stories to music to the natural environment. We saw about trees with significance in Connor's presentation, and maybe spread it out a little bit. So what was formed there was a local planning committee that basically was empowered by the city government to take the amount of budget that was going to be allotted to the creation of a tourist attraction and begin to discuss how that should best be spent. And the opinions ranged widely from the first mosque established in the city in 1967 back to the old cathedral. But it was a process of community involvement with planners and heritage professionals in which the community was not just the initiator, but they added capacity to the process. The danger that we as heritage professionals always face is this idea of the loss of authority. And it is true that some of the blanket statements about giving the power to the community is something to think about, because I think we've all seen that communities can come up with horrible ideas, just really bad ideas. So it's really a question of combining the capacity of the community with the structures of the city. Next I will show another table, and this one is in Eleuthera, the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas, which is not the major built-up island in the Bahamas, which is Nassau and Grand Bahama, but one of the out islands. And they're very concerned because up till the economic crash that we're all suffering from, the Bahamas was the real cruise capital of the world, and Nassau was the casino and beachfront hotel capital of one of the capitals of the Caribbean. And they saw the economic downturn right now as an incredible opportunity, that real estate developers were not running to buy beachfront property and putting up these disposable resorts, but they were backing off, and this gave a breathing space for the community to develop a local heritage council. Here too, it was a policy structure, if not yet a statutory one, where they began to see the heritage scape much like we see the environment today. It's not a question of saving a beautiful stand of trees or a certain element of the environment, but rather planning for the next 25 years on what the priorities need to be. Just coming to a conclusion, this is a picture of a focus group from Levuka in Fiji, an island that has been working for a World Heritage nomination for years now. But one of the other advantages of community involvement is the idea that groups within communities that have traditionally not been included in the official narrative of the community, be they groups that were always there or groups that have arrived, have a chance in a process of community engagement to gain their own kind of legitimacy, to be listened to add to what the evolving community identity is. And finally, I will show not a table, but an archaeological excavation. And this archaeological excavation is taking place in Israel, where there is a process. Process over product is sometimes a more effective way to integrate the community, not in some sort of static appreciation of their own heritage, but as a way of social interaction in the present. So I would say that, I'm happy, and I hope in the breakout groups we can talk much more about these specific examples of different modes of community involvement. But the thing to keep in mind is that it's a moving target, that community involvement and relevance is really a moving target that one has got to guide as delicately as public policy. Because it's not a zero-sum game of either expert scientific knowledge or community feeling or even individual preference to make money, to save his or her own land. It's a combination of all of them. Because conservation and documentation only being linked to collective memory tends to create a very stereotyped, very mainstream view of a community. When it's collective memory and the individual, that is human rights, we get all kinds of tales and folk tales that are really leaving out all that heritage expertise and empirical data can, in fact, contribute. And when it's just conservation and documentation and the individual, it's a very soulless kind of heritage attraction that has to be kept together. So I would say that basically the work of the Heritage Council here in Ireland is essential for the work that has to be done. Certainly, physical conservation, legislation, economic development are all the kinds of things that have to be dealt with. But the Heritage Council is in a perfect position to keep the eye on that balance of interest through its own intervening in really keeping the vessels in good order, but also encouraging people to pour their values into those vessels. So I will just end by saying that heritage these days is really about remembering forward in a way. It's not so much anymore just this idea of patrimony as it used to be, that we inherit from the past a collection of objects, which it's our responsibility to keep intact and in the condition we received them and pass them on to the future. It's really a responsibility to continue to be culturally creative, to live, to experience, to feel a kind of security that it is both your place and mine. And I think that is really the most important heritage that we can pass on to those future generations, to really make heritage something meaningful for people's lives. Thank you very much.